Good morning, it's Friday the 29th of December in London. This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast. I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, Maine becomes the second US state to try to bar Donald Trump from its Republican primary ballot. A new survey shows UK households are more worried about their financial security heading into 2024, despite slowing inflation. Plus, on the last trading day of the year, we'll look at what Wall Street's biggest names got wrong in their market predictions for 2023. Let's start with a roundup of our top stories. The top election official in the state of Maine has ruled that Donald Trump cannot run in the state's Republican primary. In her decision, Secretary of State and Democrat Shenna Bellows cited the former president's efforts to overturn the 2020 election. She added that Trump could appeal her decision, which comes just weeks before the first Republican primary in Iowa. The former president plans to file a legal objection in state court. He's faced dozens of lawsuits across the US claiming he's ineligible for another term under a legal provision which states that a person who took an oath to support the Constitution and then engaged in, quote, insurrection is ineligible to hold office. Half of the container ships which regularly use the Suez Canal are avoiding the route after the recent string of attacks by Houthi militants in the Red Sea. Data compiled by Flexport shows 299 container ships have either changed course or plan to, accounting for 18% of global trade. Mercury Resources CEO Anton Posner specialises in supply chains. He says many major firms want to know more about the US response to the attacks.
So at this point, it's a lot of wait and see in what's happening with the international coalition. We're seeing, of course, increased freight, increased insurance, a lot of uncertainty and mixed signals from ship owners, container lines, and from governments on what's happening to basically mitigate the risk and the threats that are out there from these Yemeni armed groups.
Posner added that some containers are putting off decisions until the new year while attacks continue. The US military says it's speaking with shipping companies to ease their concerns. Ukraine's Prime Minister has sounded the alarm over the country's finances as international aid dwindles. Denis Shmyhal has asked for an emergency meeting with international donors as Kyiv fears running out of money in the new year. Roughly $110 billion is held up in political wrangling by the United States and the European Union. The chipmaker Nvidia is selling a downgraded version of its gaming chip to Chinese consumers. The version for the Chinese market has about 10% fewer processing cores than what the chip giant sells in other countries. This comes after the US government has tightened restrictions on what the company can market there. Bloomberg's Ian King says so far commercial backlash is limited.
How much of a general impact it's going to make, probably not a huge amount. I mean, how many people can afford $2,000 for a card? The volume of the market is at a much lower tier than that. But really what matters is what happens in the AI accelerator market. Nvidia said it's going to have new chips for that business for China to meet these new rules. We don't know when that's coming or if that will actually come, and that will have a much more concrete impact on revenue.
Bloomberg's Ian King reporting the divide sets up a future geopolitical issue for Nvidia, which is by far the best performing semiconductor stock in 2023 and the industry's first company with a market value of $1 trillion. UK consumers are more worried about their financial security heading into the new year. A new survey shows that slowing inflation isn't enough to encourage spending as households make an effort to cut back. Bloomberg's Tiwa Adebayo has the details.
Inflation may have more than halved in 2023, but that doesn't mean households are feeling better about the economy. A KPMG survey has found 4 in 10 UK consumers say they're in a worse financial position than the end of last year. The findings add to fears the British economy will stagnate or even shrink as people cut back on spending. Add to that a warning from the Trade Union Congress that unsecured debt, excluding student loans, is set to rise by 11% next year. These factors setting a gloomy economic scene as the UK moves into an election year. In London, Tiwa Adebayo, Bloomberg Radio.
The heiress to the L'Oreal cosmetics empire has become the first woman to amass a $100 billion fortune. Françoise Bettencourt-Meyers reached the milestone on Thursday when her wealth jumped to $100.1 billion, according to the Bloomberg Billionaires Index. The increase came as shares in L'Oreal rose to a record high, with the stock set for its best year since 1998. Bettencourt-Meyers inherited the stake in the beauty products empire from her mother in 2017. Well, in a moment, we'll be discussing how the market bets from some of Wall Street's biggest names in 2023 didn't go as planned. But another Bloomberg article that caught my eye this morning was from our colleague Howard Chua-Iwan from Bloomberg Opinion about the dangers of being hangry. Apart from it being a very amusing read about Howard's experiences of being hungry, it's also a good reminder that with January in mind, the effects that hunger can have on your mood and how you behave at work. Now, that could be because perhaps you're cutting back on how much you're eating after an indulgent Christmas season, or perhaps that you're just too busy to eat. Howard's message in general is let's resolve to be aware of the conditions that contribute to hunger and take ourselves and others out of the path of what he describes as irrational rage. It's perhaps a suitable note to end the year on. You can read the full piece on the terminal or on Bloomberg.com. Well, let's get more now on the political story out of the US. The top election official in Maine has barred Donald Trump from the state's Republican primary. Bloomberg's John Harney joins us from Washington with the latest. John, great to have you with us. What has Maine's Secretary of State decided and why?
Well, she was responding, she writes in her decision, to challenges from Maine voters, and she decided that Donald Trump could not be on the Republican primary ballot because he had engaged in insurrection because of his efforts to overturn the 2020 election results, and particularly his actions on January 6, 2021, when, of course, his supporters assaulted the Capitol as electoral votes were being counted. And she points out that she did not take this decision lightly, but that no Secretary of State in Maine had ever before deprived a candidate of ballot access. But, and I'm quoting here, no presidential candidate has ever before engaged in insurrection under the 14th Amendment of the Constitution.
What has been the reaction from the Trump campaign?
Well, it was quite swift after Ms. Bellows had issued her ruling, and it immediately accused her. She is a Democrat, and she ran for the United States Senate unsuccessfully against Susan Collins back in 2020, a couple of years ago. The campaign said that this was politically motivated, this decision, and an attempt to fix the 2024 election, and it also referred to efforts to keep Trump off the ballot in other states.
This comes after, as you mentioned, a similar decision in Colorado earlier this month. Donald Trump, though, back on the ballot there. What's happened?
Well, he was there. I mean, that was a court ruling, the state Supreme Court in Colorado, that he could not be on the ballot. He was never officially taken off. But that case has now been put off because the Colorado Republican Party has petitioned the United States Supreme Court, which will almost certainly have to decide this, as it's as these cases and challenges keep arising in many states throughout the country, even as the first votes, as you pointed out, are about to be they're about the first votes of the 2024 primary season are about to take place in the Iowa caucuses in the middle of January.
What's the big picture effect of these legal challenges? Of course, as you say, there are appeals underway. What does it mean for Donald Trump's prospects for an election that's now less than a year away?
Well, it's one more. It's one more factor of one more bit of uncertainty. as he tries to as he makes his comeback or attempted comeback to win the Republican nomination and then the White House next November. He faces criminal trials in the year that may well take place in the year ahead, and possible convictions. There's also civil cases, most notably in New York, in which that might severely curtail his business. The Trump organization's business, the source of the family fortune, and at the same time, none of these setbacks seem to, or what you would think would be setbacks, seem to have harmed him, at least in the minds of many of Republican voters, and they have not helped his Republican rivals. Or President Joe Biden, of course, is running on the Democratic ticket.
Yeah, certainly, and that's going to be one of the factors that we'll be watching as we watch the legal processes continue to play out, both in Maine and in Colorado. John Harney in Washington, thank you so much for joining us with the latest on that story. That's Bloomberg's John Harney there. Well, it is the final trading day of the year for markets, and today's Bloomberg Big Take report is looking at what Wall Street's biggest names had been expecting to see this year and how those calls held up during the year. The consensus view formed around three things mainly: sell US stocks, buy treasuries and buy Chinese stocks. To talk us through how that went, we're joined by our senior global equity markets reporter, Jan Patrick Barnard. JP, great to have you with us. First of all, what formed the basis of these calls a year ago?
Good morning. Well, I mean, at the core was the idea that the U.S. Federal Reserve would drive the U.S. economy into a recession, and that, of course, would have the ripple effects to stocks and bonds, meaning that everybody expected U.S. stocks will lead a decline in global markets, and that the Fed will then have to cut rates, and hence it would be a good idea to be long bonds. So that was at the core of the prediction. As we now all know, didn't go that way. But it was very hard to make the call at the beginning of the year, given everything that happened before, mainly with the pandemic and all the effects it had on the economy and the consumer. So I wouldn't go too hard on those being wrong for this year, because it really was a tough call to make.
Of course, regular listeners know that the reality of the year's trading didn't match the expectations from those big Wall Street calls. Talk us through what happened, first of all, to US stocks and bonds. Why didn't that pan out as had perhaps been expected?
Yeah, it was very surprising. I mean, there were early signs in January, February that the economy would held up better than expected. I guess everybody was very surprised that the consumer was still very strong. Those savings that piled up during the pandemic helped a lot with that. So that goes back to the idea that I said it's hard to make a prediction when you have those kinds of mechanics that you can't really predict what's going on. So the corporate earnings front also looked very healthy. Corporates were able to take those higher inflations from producing stuff and forward this to the consumer. So that helped a lot with the earnings. I mean, we saw earnings contraction, of course, but the top line held up well. The margins still looked healthy. So all that, of course, helped to pile stocks up. And then you added let's say not one-off effects, but these special circumstances, mainly the frenzy about artificial intelligence that propelled all those mega caps to new highs, which of course then has big effects on the broader indices. And then the obesity trade was a big one. So those one-off trades or one-off themes also helped the market a lot. Nobody saw that coming, and that pushed stocks to levels we haven't seen.
What about the China question then? Because that was one that quite a lot of these analysts got wrong.
Yeah, definitely. And it's kind of an interesting story, because there was the notion of a reopening trade in China. And I would say that if you look at European stocks, this notion held up pretty well throughout the year, because if you look at the Germany stocks, for example, who is highly skewed towards China, is trading at an all-time high right now. So it worked for Europe. It didn't work so well for the Chinese stocks itself. I think the Hang Seng is down minus 14% or something this year, because the economy still struggled, and the government had to push out measure after measure to keep the economy some kind of afloat. So it's interesting that domestically, the market is still like having a very bearish and very doomish view on China, while you have the outside view from everybody who is like importing into China is rather sanguine about it. So it's an interesting twofold story this year.
JP, does it matter that these calls didn't work out? Is it going to change how people look at the calls people are making for next year?
Well, I guess it's a good lesson that even like the most brightest and smartest people on Wall Street can be wrong from time to time. Again, it was a very hard prediction to make with the pandemic and everything that were satelliting around it to get everything into place and make this call. So I would say like, if it's just about this year, we can be very forgiven that those people were wrong. What I didn't really understand, and that was the more shocking part to me, is like when there were signs in, let's say, January, February, and especially after the banking crisis was resolved in March, it looked all very good. The economic indicators looked good. The earnings looked good. And I was very surprised that those big strategists didn't reverted their calls and said like, okay, we were wrong. This looks better. We have to tone down our bearish view. And they held to it like very long, almost until summer, until they then folded their hands. So I would blame them for that for sure.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond. Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere you get your podcasts. You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com. Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa device. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.